let me introduce our stellar guest for this evening. Suella is the Member of Parliament, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Fareham and Waterlooville, previously just Fareham since 2015. A passionate long-term campaigner for leaving the EU, she led the highly influential group of Eurosceptic Conservative MPs, the European Research Group, during that crucial period from 2016 to 2017. She was appointed in 2018 Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, but resigned 11 months later in protest at Theresa May's deal. Not merely a staunch Brexiteer, a positive Spartan. She went on to hold high office, of course, in government, most notably as our Home Secretary and Attorney General for England and Wales, reflecting her background as a senior, highly qualified lawyer. She's tough on immigration, an opponent of net zero, a bold anti-woke campaigner, and of course, a very, very firm favourite with the Conservative Party grassroots. And that's why she's the first and so far only person we've ever invited back to do her second Pop Conversation. Suella, great to have you with us. How the very devil are you? We've got to take you off mute, take yourself off mute. Always easy to forget that. Always easy to forget that. There you go. You're off mute. Now we can hear you.
Are we live? PopCon is go. Great. No, we're making history tonight.
We are making history.
I'm the first guest to have been invited back. This is a auspicious occasion, Mark. I'm deeply honoured to be in such great company.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us. Look, let's start with what happened last week. The local elections, a by-election in Runcorn, a swathe of mayoral elections too. I've been digesting over the weekend and sent out my weekly bulletin later than usual yesterday with my thoughts on it. But I mean, this was a pretty ghastly result for the Conservative Party, right?
Well, there's no sugarcoating it. We lost hundreds of really hardworking, dedicated and experienced councillors all over the country. And yeah, these were very bad results for us. They were very bad results for Labour. And, you know, the big winners are reform from these local elections. There's no way to spin that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually feeling a bit sorry for Paul Bristow in a way. Most people should be feeling, but I just sort of banked that as the one good part of the night is that Paul's going to, you know, win in Cambridgeshire. So when he did, rather than punching the air, I just breathed a sigh of relief. It reminded me an awful lot of July the 4th, where I knew we were going to get battered. But, you know, each win, yours and various others, I was like, sigh of relief, they're back. The only punch the air moment was Ian Duncan Smith winning Chingford, I think.
Yeah.
Why do you think the Conservative Party did so badly? I mean, I was braced for a bad result, but I expected us to lose, let's say, half of the seats we were defending from a very high watermark. But I think in rough and ready terms, 2/3 of seats we were defending, we lost, which is almost exactly the same proportion as the parliamentary constituencies that we were defending last July. 2/3 of your colleagues went down. Why, you know, some considerable months on, what is it now, 10 months on from the general election, are we still getting that level of rejection from the British electorate, do you think?
Because people don't get over their anger and sense of betrayal and frustration overnight. And the historic defeat that we all experienced last July really, you know, was a symptom and a consequence of people's frustration with the Conservative Party and our failure to keep our promises on notable things like immigration and taxation. And I think that anti-Conservative sentiment is still very strong. And so I do see these results as very much part of the same process and experience that we went through last year and towards the end of towards the general election. You know, we had plummeted in the polls, you know, a good year before the 2024 general election was called. So This has been, public opinion has been largely against us for a few years now, and it doesn't just change overnight. We've got a very long and hard road ahead of us.
Do you think sort of time's the greatest healer there? I mean, I'm not hoping it takes us this long to get back into government, but it would be unusual if in, say, 2040, people were still saying, oh, I'm never going to vote for you again because of Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. Is it just a question of, if you wait long enough, give it another year, give it another couple of years, the people's memories of the kind of nightmare tail end, at least, of our 14 years in office just fades somewhat, and we just need to be patient about that happening? Do you think time is the greatest healer, or do we need to be a bit more physician, heal thyself?
I don't think it's just a matter of time, not at all. I think that the Conservative Party needs fundamental change if we are to regain the trust of millions of people, whether it's people who actually left us and voted for reform, or people who didn't even bother to vote because they were so disenchanted with us and the political system. We made, grotesque errors of policy in the last few years. We totally failed to stop illegal migration because we didn't have the political will to do what was necessary, namely leave the ECHR. I'm sure we'll come to that later. We, opened the floodgates when it came to net migration and legal migration. In 2022, we had issued over 1 million work and study visas. That was in a so-called post-Brexit take back control of your borders world. And taxation reached a 70-year high on our watch. So those are things that we did. Those are things we must never do again. But before we even get near to a position of power, we need to prove to the British people that they can trust us and that we will never make such bad errors of judgment, and we won't break promises again in such a way in the future.
And how on earth does one go about doing that from a stint in opposition with so few MPs, the fewest number of MPs sitting in the Conservative interest since, I don't know, the time of the Duke of Wellington or something? I mean, how does one go about proving that, other than just stating it and hoping people believe you?
Well, I think that's why a policy agenda is absolutely essential. Ultimately, people will judge us on our ability to reflect, ability to humbly take responsibility for our failings, and then a recognition that we are changing. And the clearest way that we can demonstrate change is through our policy. And I do think we need bold policies that cut through, that actually send the message to people that we have changed. I don't think, we've often fallen into the trap as Conservatives of technocratic, clever sounding changes, but actually amount to very little at all. And they end up being tweaks. And people see through that. The electorate are not stupid, and they are crying out for radical reform of our country, because there are very few things that work well in our country when it comes to public services. Businesses, workers, families, farmers are all feeling like they might not survive economically the next few years. These are very, very serious fears that working people have today because of Labour's decisions. And so we need to make sure that we are credible, and that we have demonstrated that we are up for meaningful. It doesn't really mean about radical, but meaningful reform.
Do you think the problem's even worse than that? I mean, I'm trying to imagine a scenario in which Kemi and the Conservative Party come out and say, we've got a shiny new policy. We're going to limit net immigration to tens of thousands. Might be a sensible policy, but who on earth's going to believe it? Because we've said that so many times before and failed to deliver it. And, my worry is that you only get so many drinks in the last chance saloon, right? And were that to be our policy, that net immigration would be limited to tens of thousands, I mean, I won't say who it was, but somebody of the more Cameroonian tendency within the party tried to spin to me that we'd actually kept our promise, that it was kept to tens of thousands. It was just that it was 80 tens of thousands that we'd kept it to, that it's possible for tens of thousands to be multiples of hundreds of thousands. Coming up with such a pledge or a promise, given how many have been broken, is, may not be sufficient, right? Even if the policy is well-intentioned, even if it's sincere, even if it's brilliantly worked out, folk might just say, yeah, I heard all of this before.
I can understand why they might think that. And that's why I don't think we can take one policy in isolation and say, there, you can believe us now, you can trust us now. I think it's going to take a spectrum of policy offers that demonstrate that we are not the old party. And so immigration is one aspect. Taxation, we need to offer something bold and meaningful. Human rights, bold and meaningful reform is needed. And then, the party needs to get behind this bold and meaningful agenda. And if we have a united party behind that agenda, I think that, with time, will be a credible offer.
So, yeah, Jeff Mitchell touches on this point and a number of others on a similar topic. He asks, when, oh, when are we real conservatives going to be given more than just be patient, we are listening? He puts that in quotes. I, for one, want to hear some true blue policies, lower tax, zero immigration, not zero carbon emissions, etc. Do you think we've got to move on to this sort of space pretty rapidly?
Listen, I think, Kemi set out her plan, and she's announced the policy commissions. She was voted in on that plan. And I think it's, she has announced some policy, platforms on a few issues. So I think, we've got to get behind the leader. We've got to support her plan. And, she's in charge, and the plan has been supported by a majority of members.
I want to turn to the other big story. Obviously, as members of the Conservative Party, we're reflecting on a very bad night for the Conservatives. Very disappointing results last Thursday. But there is this new shiny electoral phenomenon, looks like a bit of can sometimes feel like an unstoppable force at the moment, of Farage and Reform UK. What did you make of their performance? Because whilst the Conservative Party performance was, to my mind, I was expecting it to be poor, but was on the kind of heavy downside of poor from my expectations. Reform's performance was on the heavy upside of my expectations, not in every single area. I'm sort of surprised they only won the Runcorn by-election by 6 votes, to be honest. And, they didn't pull off winning the mayor of Doncaster. It wasn't unalloyed victory everywhere, which might speak to a weakness of their ground game. But this is a spectacular achievement by an insurgent party, isn't it?
I mean, this time last year, Reform were like nowhere in the political kind of context. And so they've achieved a phenomenal level of success in less than a year. And, that deserves some recognition. They are, on the up. They're here to stay, as far as I see it. And I think these local elections were a significant turning point for them, because they've proved that they can go beyond the 20% mark in the polls. They can win by elections. They can take control of whole local authorities. And, they are commanding a huge amount of support within the electorate. And that, again, that's not going to change overnight. I'm sure they're going to keep proceeding with momentum, because they are speaking to that frustration, sense of betrayal and disenchantment that millions of people feel with both the Conservative Party and now, more latterly, the Labour Party. And so the big test for Reform is how will they govern? But they have, achieved a huge amount, and I can very much understand why people are flocking to Reform in high numbers.
And that's interesting what you said about, it's not, you don't think this is a flash in the pan. I mean, oftentimes, sophologists, experts of political history, I mean, whether it's sincere or a wish, will say, Well, you get these things happen, but then the two-party system reasserts itself. Witness the rapid rise and then collapse of the SDP, for example, in the 1980s, or even in its former iterations. The Brexit Party wins the Euro elections in the summer of 2019, and then is nowhere to be seen in the general election of 2019. They pull out to support the Conservatives. You think there's something here that is potentially more permanent than an SDP win in a by-election in the 1980s, right?
Yes, definitely. I don't think this is I don't think it's equivalent to the SDP. And if you look at the extent of their victory at the local level, that adds an extra level of important resource, fundamentally, because every political party needs its grassroots supporters. I'm speaking to many right now. It's our collective effort on the ground. It's the delivering of leaflets, it's the canvassing, it's the fundraising, it's that army, Reform Cause and the People's Army. That's what wins elections at the end of the day, in terms of the success of a political party. So they've now managed to mobilize all of that sentiment and support and translate it into consolidated activism on the ground, which is resulting in local election victories. And so I think that is very, very, a very strong platform for them to build going forward. I'd also say, the Brexit Party example is not comparable. They bowed out in the spirit of the national interest, and that was a decision that Nigel Farage made in the run-up to the 2019 general election. It wasn't because they were lacking momentum or they didn't have support, and it was because Nigel Farage pulled out that the Conservatives won such a large majority. He's made it clear he would not do that right now. So I'm one of these people who is very pragmatic, and I look at the maths and I see what the numbers show at the moment. And of course, this is very early in the parliamentary cycle and lots of things can happen. Goodness knows, the last few years have been very unpredictable when it comes to British politics. And with all those caveats, if things stay the same or largely the same going into the next few years, we've got to face the very real possibility that as Conservatives, we may well be working with the Reform Party. Everybody says no, of course, right now. But, if our objective is to prevent a decade of socialism, then I would be very happy to work with Reform. But of course, there's no deal, and neither leader is is negotiating with each other right now. But I think that these numbers will either demonstrate that there needs to be some form of accommodation between Reform and the Conservatives, a uniting of the right, in effect, to stop Labour coming back again to ruin our country even more after 2028, 29, or we see another 5 years of Labour.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting that
that's rule out the possibility as well of a Labour Lib Dem coalition.
Yeah,
Because if the Labour support on the left collapses, I would not doubt for a minute Labour's opportunism to get into a coalition with the Lib Dems to keep the right out of British politics.
Yeah, it's interesting, this, isn't it? I mean, a senior person in the Reform Party said to me that any form of electoral alliance or understanding is completely impossible until it becomes totally inevitable, and that inflection point could be very quick, right? So it's ruled out. But if it becomes inevitable, now, Suella, I've got to put this question to you from Jane Newell. She asks, would Suella definitely rule out joining Reform, and if not, why not? If you're not ruling it out, why wouldn't you rule it out? Or, I mean, let me give you a bit of time to collect your thoughts out. I mean, one of the key reasons, because I was at the IEA for so long, partisan and neutral, I couldn't be a member of a party, but I joined the Conservative Party the day after my contract with the IEA ended last year. But one, not the only one by any manner or means, but one of my considerations was that the Conservative Party was clearly the best electoral vehicle to beat the left. And I judged in July of last year that, even though we were almost certainly going to get thrashed, we would come second in votes and form the official opposition. And whilst I had a lot of sympathy for what a lot of things Reform were saying, they were going to come third or fourth in votes, win 1, 2, 3, 4, as it happened, 5 seats. And whilst this was a very noble enterprise, I was more interested in actually forming a right of centre government than splitting the vote and having fewer right of centre MPs. But now the electoral viability question of Reform doesn't stick as much, right? I remember back in the day, Philip Davies saying he agreed much more with Nigel Farage than David Cameron, but Nigel Farage and UKIP had no chance of winning. Therefore, sensible people should coalesce around the Conservative brand. That's proving to be, a harder line of argument to take, frankly, isn't it? So what's your take on that when Jane asks, would you rule out joining Reform? And if not, why not? If you wouldn't join, why not?
Well, I'm a member of the Conservative Party. I was elected by the great people of Fareham, Waterlooville as a Conservative member of Parliament, and I'm working as a Conservative, and I've been a member of the party. I think I'm losing count of the decades now. Actually, I was one of those geeks who joined in her teenage years. I think I was 14 or 15 to help my mum. I was encouraged by my mum. She was a Conservative councillor at the time in Brent. And so I really was joined up to deliver leaflets for her, to be honest. So, this is many decades and it's in my family.
That's interesting. And let's also just touch on, because although they've obviously had a very good few days, actually a very good few months, some of Reform's weaknesses, right? Or at least differences with the Conservative Party. This is an interesting one. Sandra Daniels says, I was a Reform general election candidate, but since I've got really fed up with their lack of organisation and structure and their top-down management, and I've left. If Conservatives can come up with the right policies, people will come back. I know I will. Will us ex-reformers be welcomed back in the Tory fold? And then Ruth Eads asks, how can we win back our supporters lost to Reform? So I guess those two sort of go together. Maybe they're a little bit more fragile than we think, actually. Farage is obviously a monumental political phenomenon and a superstar and, an exceptional campaigner and communicator. But some things are potentially already gone awry for them. And you could imagine that it's a bit of a deck of cards, that it wouldn't actually take too much for the whole thing to blow up because it's such a sort of startup operation. What do you think?
Yes, it is politics. But Rishi fell out with Boris and Boris fell out with Theresa on our side. Currently, Ed Miliband's for the chop and has fallen out with Keir Starmer. I think in any political party, you're going to get friction and issues, and Reform is no different. So I think that I personally think assuming Reform will suffer a rapid demise is unfounded. I just can't see that happening given the strength of support. And I've just many of the listeners here will have seen it. But I think the combination of speaking to people's frustration and sense of betrayal, their reforms and their policies on things like the ECHR and net zero and woke and meritocracy and patriotism, and the fact that they are gaining support not just in Conservative heartlands but in Labour heartlands, I think is a very strong set of circumstances for Reform. And I think it will, we've got to face the fact that Reform is here to stay. That's my very strong view. And we need, as a Conservative Party, need to work in that world and see how we regain the trust of those millions who left us for Reform.
Are you sympathetic, therefore, to Jacob Rees-Mogg's broad view that he actually thinks some form of rapprochement between the Conservatives and Reform shouldn't really, in theory, be that difficult? because it's a little bit obvious about where the electoral strengths and weaknesses of each lie. And it might go back a bit to what you were saying about it'd be unfair to call it an informal electoral pact between the Lib Dems and Labour, but there seems to be a nod and a wink that, the Labour Party understands there are Conservative seats that only the Liberal Democrats could win, and the Liberal Democrats understand there are Conservative seats that only Labour could win. And to some degree, Reform and the Conservatives might be a mirror image of that, right? That it's pretty unlikely to see Reform UK winning, I don't know, Surrey Heath or Esher, for the sake of argument, seats in the more sort of affluent middle class South. But then it's quite hard now, I would think, to see the Conservatives winning Sunderland South, for sake of argument, seats in the more industrial North. Doesn't that sort of speak to where some might say, and I know some of your colleagues say, that means we should focus on the South and become a bit more Lib Demi to try and win back seats in Oxfordshire and Surrey and Hampshire and the like. But whatever the lineup is for the Tory party, isn't that sort of the way we're going, that the Conservatives will be typically stronger in affluent middle class areas, typically sort of south of Birmingham, and Reform typically stronger sort of north of Birmingham, and on the east coast of the country it might end up being a straight Conservative Reform battle, in which case, go in and may the best man win?
I'm not sure I agree with that analysis, actually, because look at Kent. Home counties went to Reform.
Mm-hmm.
Polling suggests they would have gained Essex. They would have done very well in Norfolk. They came second in, did very, very well in Devon. So I'm not sure it's as clear cut as that, actually. And if it meant that the Conservatives had to revert to this kind of Cameroon Lib Dem light, centrist dad. Sorry if there are any centrist dads online. No centrist dads in PopCon.
Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell regularly join us on these calls.
Right.
So I'll have you.
Yes. Hello, Rory. Hello, Alistair, if you're online. If we were going to revert back to that formula, I think it would not be, I think that would be a losing formula for the Conservative Party, and we would just be going backwards. Again, people are crying out for a strong patriotic party, a party that isn't scared to be conservative. I think, my sense, if I were to sum it all up, actually, it would be, for too long, we've actually been a bit scared of our own shadow, a bit shy of being conservative. We've been meek when it's come to making the argument for business and a small state and lower taxes. We've been shy and squeamish about talking about strong borders and the need for lower immigration because we're scared of being called racist. We didn't really ever tackle the spiraling welfare crisis that we've got in this country because we didn't want to come across as cruel. We've lost our backbone in many ways, and it's about rediscovering that robust, patriotic voice that speaks to all of those grafters and strivers and people who are taking personal responsibility and moving forward with their lives and want to achieve and, live for aspiration and want to contribute. We've kind of really abandoned those people in the past. And so I think actually unintentionally, I don't think that was our intention. I think we've just been so caught up with wanting to detoxify the Conservative brand that we've moved so far away from what it is to be an authentic conservatism, that woke got out of control on our watch, that we had Conservative ministers standing up and saying a trans woman is a woman. We had Conservative MPs taking the knee. That's how bad it got in the last Parliament, all because we didn't want to come across as harsh and cruel or racist or, phobic. And we've let the law-abiding, patriotic, common sense majority down in doing so. So the last thing we must do is try and get scared of what it is to be a Conservative and start reverting to this kind of we're the nasty party and we've got to apologise constantly for wanting to cut migration. That would be a disaster.
Yeah, I agree.
We're not the nasty party, just for the record. We're not, those values of authentic Conservatives are anything but nasty.
Yeah, we should be proud of these values.
To empower that, that kid born into poverty on a council estate, inspiring Conservative values of personal responsibility, endeavour, determination, innovation, service, family, community, love of country. That those values, which is what inspires me as a conservative, are the most empowering, compassionate, opportunity driven values, and anything but the nasty party.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I mean, talking of the South, actually, it's not a very upvoted question, but Jeff Towney says, "Good to see you again, Suella." And he actually says to me, "Mark, looking forward to seeing you at Fratton Park next season. If you think it's been hard being a Conservative in recent months, try being a Southampton fan. That's been a lot more brutal, trust me." You're a Portsmouth fan, aren't you, Suella?
Well, listen, I had to maintain a diplomatic neutrality as the MP for Fareham, which was pretty much equidistant between the Saints and Pompey for many years. But now I've moved eastwards, so I can come out as a Pompey fan,
There
really.
you go. It's amazing we're on speaking
Sorry.
terms.
I
It's
know,
amazing we're on
sorry.
speaking
Shall I
terms.
just go now?
Look, we touched on it a bit, but I want to move on to what do you think the Conservative response to all of this should be? Now, you've said a bit that, we should put down some more markers on things like immigration. We should be out and proud about being Conservatives. I mean, PopCon's mission is that we think that the right of politics needs to completely rewire and restructure the British state, and that if we don't do that, even winning an election's probably not enough to bring about meaningful change. And evidence A for that is the 14 years that the Conservative had in government, whilst the country itself didn't really become more conservative in any meaningful metric. What if you were leader of the party rather than Kemi? What would your recipe be for what we need to do with the rise of reform, winning back trust, mapping a way to winning a right of centre majority at the next general election?
Well, I think, and I'm sure many people on the line will be familiar with this. I do think we've got to leave the ECHR, and we mustn't fudge it. I think for years we've got we've had promises of doing whatever it takes, and I'll reform the ECHR, and I'll go and talk to the people who are members of the ECHR, and I'll go and sock it to them, and at the Council of Europe, or we'll disapply the Human Rights Act for parts of this and that. And I just think it's not going to address the gap, the credibility gap that we have. And so we need to take a deep breath, and we need to take the plunge, and we need to commit to leaving the ECHR pure and simple. And I think if it's kind of a symbolic. I talk about it a lot. I've written about it a lot. So I know I'm a broken record. I think I was one of the first Conservative MPs to go public about leaving the ECHR, much to the disgrace, the disappointment and horror of several of my colleagues. But I'm very glad that more and more people over the years are seeing the need for us to leave the ECHR. Not a day or not a week goes by when we don't see another absurd case from an immigration judge or a Strasbourg judge, which just underlines the necessity and urgency to get out of this politicized interventionist court, which doesn't have our values at its heart. I think we need to thereafter scrap the Human Rights Act and actually deal with what I call the long tail of Blairism, what we failed to do over the last decade, but deal with these kind of quite entrenched pieces of legislation that have been the source of so many problems that we deal with. We deal with the consequences of them anyway. So the Human Rights Act is a exacerbating factor when it comes to our human rights laws. That's one of the reasons why people say, oh well, the Danes have managed to reject 90% of their asylum seekers, and they're members of the ECHR. Yeah, but they don't have the Human Rights Act, which domesticates the European Convention and kind of adds bells and whistles onto it. So we need to get rid of the Human Rights Act, a legacy of Tony Blair. We need to scrap the Equality Act, another pernicious piece of legislation that's really the source of the DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion madness that we see in much of our public sector and most of our public sector and much of our private sector as well. The unconscious bias training and the confessions of white privilege and the all the diversity champions and the Stonewall programs and the irreversible surgical treatment on many young people when it comes to the transgender ideology. A lot of that has its roots in the Equality Act. I wrote about it in last week's Telegraph, actually, if you want to read the detail, but there are certain sections in that legislation which effectively legislate for anti-white discrimination. And positive action, whereby it allows recruiters to prefer minority candidates, even if it's not fair. So scrap the Equality Act and deal with this issue of two-tier justice and the lack of confidence in our policing. For too long, our system of accountability and the leadership within policing has really failed. And we've had, a fall in the use of stop and search powers and a corollary increase in knife crime.
Yeah.
There's a connection between those two things. We see, more and more officers leave the force because of low morale. At the same time, when we've seen a specialist firearms officer, Sergeant Martin Blake, put on trial for murder when he was doing his duty to keep.
And now a misconduct hearing.
I mean, you'd think the nightmare would be over for him. He was the police officer. They're really highly trained. They're really specialist, special officers, and they don't pull the trigger recklessly. They do it if their life is in danger, if their colleague's life is, someone else's life is in danger. And he was up against a convicted criminal, a gangster, Chris Carver. The man died and he was put on trial for murder. Absolutely absurd that the CPS brought those charges. And, he was acquitted in a matter of a few hours, unanimous acquittal. But yes, as you say, now under disciplinary investigation by the regulator.
That speaks unbelievably well of jury trial, right? As soon as you put 12 average British men and women to decide this, they acquitted him in 3 hours.
Yeah.
The minute you put quangos and judges and the CPS in charge of this, there seems to be a kind of woke attack on, perfectly normal behaviour. And although I feel very sorry for him, obviously, absolute nightmare, I'm also worried that no police officer is going to pull the trigger on a gun in future for fear what might happen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a symptom of this political correctness that's taken over a lot of, not policing as a whole, but the policing leadership. And it's certain chief constables who have really, there's no better way of putting it, but have gone woke. I remember when I was Home Secretary, I was aghast when one of the chief constables, I think it was for Avon and Somerset, suddenly came out and confessed to institutional racism. Because, ultimately she thought that would improve relations with minority communities. Absolutely wrong-headed thinking, smearing thousands of officers who are decent and not racist and are doing their job, putting their lives at risk often for very little thanks. And just because a police leader wanted to appease as opposed to stand up robustly for truth and fairness, you get absurdities like that. Non-crime hate incidents, the list is very long.
We brought those in though. We brought those in.
Well, they were they have a longer history than us, but we didn't do much I tried. That's my common refrain. I tried, but I wasn't able to scrap them. But we tried to raise the bar. We did raise the bar. I issued new guidance to raise the bar for when one would be recorded. But the police really generally ignored that guidance. But no, they are a creation of the Macpherson report after the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence. It was decided that there needed to be a kind of precursor to criminal activity so that the police would have a data when it came to racism. So not a racist murder, but they would be able to log racist incidents. And that's I can very much see the logic.
Hang on. That sounds to me like a tick box exercise, right? Obviously you want to keep a watch on people who you fear might go out and cause crime. So, you know, I mean, this oversimplifies it, but, you know, if you've got a Ku Klux Klan chapter in your area, I would expect the police to be sort of broadly aware of them, you know, who might be there. The same goes for the way we deal with terrorism in general, right? That you keep a, but why do we need to issue them with like yellow cards or tickets or post-it notes? Why isn't it just a matter of intelligence gathering?
Well, that's what they originally started out as kind of incidents which didn't quite hit the criminal threshold, but were very bad nonetheless. And they started off, you know, as a response to the Macpherson report about the Stephen Lawrence murder. But then, on our watch, they did expand, and they expand because of the Equality Act, because of all the personal characteristics. And so all of the other personal characteristics, so it started off with race, and then it went to anything on gender, and it went to anything on sexuality, and anything on gender reassignment, and anything on religion, and anything that was said or commented on that could be perceived. And this is the key weakness in non-crime hate incidents. It's a very subjective test, and it's about whether anybody feels offended by what has been said. It doesn't matter if it objectively what has been said or done is not racist or sexist or homophobic. If I might feel offended by what you've said, Mark, and it could be an innocuous.
You frequently are, I'm sure.
If I, just by virtue of me being offended by what you've said, regardless of the rationality of that, is enough to trigger the police to come and take action and log it probably as a non-crime hate incident. It's an unworkable standard to have such a subjective test on what constitutes a non-crime hate, and that's why they've got out of control. The police use them as a badge of honor, especially where there's a woke chief constable who say, well, this month, you know, we've logged 2,000 or we've logged 200 non-crime hate incidents. This shows that we are, you know, looking after minority rights. I mean, it's all, you know, justice, truth, and fairness have all been inverted by virtue of this practice. And of course, freedom of speech has an absolute chilling effect.
Well, it seems to me you can either choose between a right to freedom of speech or a right not to be offended, but you can't have both. And you've certainly got to put one above the other, right? And I would choose freedom of speech over the right not to be offended. But at the moment, we seem to have gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah, we have. And we want to wrap people in cotton wool. And I mean, the employment rights bill going through Parliament right now, and the banter ban. And Lord Toby Young's been very good on trying to fight this, and I think he's tabling some amendments in the House of Lords at the moment. Is in another symptom of this trend that you talk about. I mean, that goes even further. If someone overhears a conversation which may offend them, subjectively speaking, not objectively, subjectively speaking, you know, that could lead to some kind of sanction from the bill. I mean,
I'm offended that Southampton have got to play Portsmouth in a lower division next season. So I look forward to what the police are going to do about that. But I should try and get through a few more questions. I mean, an interesting thing on what you've just said, Suella, is that strikes me that would be a pretty good platform for the Conservative Party rebuilding. But Martin Bristow asks, does Suella believe the Conservative Party has the time to proceed as Kemi is on policy, given Reform's electoral cut-through? And then others have asked, let me just find the questions here as well. If you like, what's the difference between what you're putting forward and Anne-Marie Cooper has asked this, Lee Nanalingham has asked this. A lot of your suggestions are already Reform Party policy. How do you differentiate from Reform, or just avoid looking, it would look like the optics in that horrible new term in politics, that the Conservatives were just sort of doing this because Farage and Reform have already done it, and we're just sort of copying a bit belatedly. How would you tackle those things?
Well, so I'm not one of these people who will kind of attack Reform, really. There's a lot of things within the Reform agenda that I agree with, and that's pretty clear for anyone to see. So I very much understand the sense of anger that people have felt. That's been a very strong motivator for them to go and vote Reform. And I've felt that anger. I've felt that sense of betrayal and that disappointment. So I've very much understand the journey that many people are going on. So as a Conservative, and we're here for the Conservative Party, we need to work really hard to regain that trust, and it takes a long time. It takes time to regain trust after such letdown. So that is the exercise that Kemi is leading, and we all have to get behind her and support her to do that.
So here's a kind of difficult question about where the party is. I mean, the first thing is, lots of people have been saying that we're now in the world of multi-party politics, right? That two-party politics has broken down, and lots of, I guess, the results on Thursday suggest that it's not just Reform. The Liberal Democrats did well. The Greens did okay, perhaps not as well as they might have expected. Donald Blaney says the UUP and the SDLP in Northern Ireland, the main Unionist Party and the main Republican Party, were actually replaced by the DUP and Sinn Féin, now a different main Unionist Party and a different main Republican Party. Why should the Conservatives assume we've got the right to remain one of the two main choices? I was also talking to a reformer the other day about the two-party system, multi-party politics. Is it breaking down? And he actually said, which surprised me for a moment, no, two-party politics is here to stay. The only difference is that the two parties are Reform and the Lib Dems, not Conservatives and Labour anymore. And I guess a challenge for us, a few people have raised this, is the Conservative Party, I mean, the agenda you just laid out, music to my ears, and I think to most on this call, but is the Conservative Party equipped to do this? Or are you and your 120 colleagues actually so divided on these big issues of the day, ECHR, carbon net zero, what is a woman? I mean, on Brexit, pretty much split the Conservative Parliamentary Party down the middle. We've had one question about, beyond ECHR, should we also be in favour of leaving the World Health Organization, for example? Does the Conservative Party now find itself in a position in which one wing of it is just so completely opposed to the other wing of the party on all of these big issues that we end up not rolling out these policies, or even the opposite policies, in any sort of hurry to keep the party together? It seems that we've almost got to be on the one hand this, on the other hand that, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. I mean, lots of, Farage says half of the Conservative Party should join Reform and the other half should join the Liberal Democrats. Do you think the Conservatives can unite around this agenda?
Well, I don't think it's right for us to assume any God-given right to exist in response to Donald's point. So I think that we have to take the threat from left and right and this current, unprecedented political climate really seriously. And I am not in the camp of assuming that Labour's unpopularity will automatically mean that support will come to us, or that Reform will suddenly disappear. I think that there is a very serious challenge facing the Conservative Party. We need to change, or we may not exist in the future. And I think the enormity of that challenge needs to be cognizant, or taken into account by all of us members of the Conservative Party, because only then will we rise to the challenge of what is expected of us. I think it's half measures, tweaking, saying one thing but trying to keep the others happy, and fudging everything and sitting on the fence, and this kind of vanilla trying to be nice to everybody approach that we've had for so long has got us into this existential situation. And we need to discover our backbone, be a bold and brave advocate of authentic patriotism and common sense values without apology. And I think the minute we start to do that, people will start hearing our message. And, I think that is the route to success.
I just wanted to ask you, as you touched on it a few minutes ago, Suella, about, the things you tried to do as Home Secretary and in government. Another one of PopCon's core propositions is, it's not just about the legislative framework in the UK, judicial activism, the Equality Act, the HRA, which I agree with you, leaving the ECHR and leaving the Human Rights Act untouched would be an almost pointless exercise, right? We'd still be locked into it domestically, even if we weren't by treaty. But the quangocracy, I think it's Liz Truss's estimate, there are 444 quangos in Britain. I sometimes joke that CCHQ is the 445th quango in Britain. But this is unbelievable that we have so many independent arm's length bodies that are actually making decisions. The Sentencing Guidance Council, for example. I mean, it's two-tier justice, but it seems to be happening almost without the Justice Secretary being aware of it. I'm not excusing her for that. What was sort of your experience? Was it to get anything conservative done in government, and you were at the very highest levels of it? How much did it feel like trying to push water uphill?
Oh, almost every day. Absolutely. And I think Liz has put it this way, that ministers are accountable but not powerful, which is the worst of both worlds, because we have distributed and diluted executive power so much over the last few decades that ministers have become mere figureheads, actually, for the work that a quango might actually do behind the scenes. So for me, my main battles were with the OBR, our friend the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, on net migration. And the OBR just was wedded to the fatally flawed view, in my opinion, that more migration into the country was a net benefit for the economy. And they just believed that with a religious zeal, it felt at times when I was in conversations with them, and they wouldn't budge and they wouldn't listen to the evidence that I put to them, that productivity has been sluggish and economic growth has been sluggish for the whole decade of unprecedented and rising immigration. GDP per capita, more importantly, has been low and falling. Wonder why that is, as we see rising levels of immigration. They refuse to take into account the costs of predominantly low-skilled, low-wage migrants on our public services and on long-term social security costs. They just assumed, 500,000 people coming into the country are going to be 500,000 more economic units, and that's just going to be good for our revenue. And that highly simplistic view has was really a massive roadblock for me, because I couldn't change their minds as the Home Secretary.
This is a kind of madness, isn't it? You've just explained to me that you, as the Home Secretary, were giving evidence to them. It should be the other way round, right? Why is our democratically elected Home Secretary having to provide evidence to these completely unelected bureaucrats? Whatever their opinions are, I would have thought their function is provide evidence to you, which you might then sort of say, well, actually that doesn't stack up in my mind. You haven't persuaded me. I'm sorry, thank you for your thoughtful analysis, but we're not going down that route. It seems we got this the other way round. We got our democratically elected politicians on bended knee trying to persuade the bureaucrats that they're wrong. What on earth is happening?
That was exactly the dynamic. And I think at that particular time, in the autumn of 2022 and then going into 2023, cabinet ministers just did not want to upset the OBR. And there was a slavish adherence to whatever the OBR said at Number 10, at the Treasury, at generally all the other departments. And the Home Office, and this is not new for the Home Office, the Home Office is often the outlier when it comes to arguing for lower immigration, but has to go into battle with the Health Department, who says, well, we want more doctors, and the Education Department that says, well, we want students in, and the Business Department and the Rural Affairs Department. That is, my battles were not peculiar in that sense. I was fighting a bigger battle, I think, because I really wanted to turn this massive tide of out of control net migration. But the roadblock was the OBR, because the OBR overshadowed all other ministerial opinion.
this is complete. This is a revelation and complete insanity, isn't it? I mean, I I wouldn't really have a kind of process problem if you were locking horns with the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? And the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, look, yeah, we want much more immigration. I'm persuaded it's all great for the economy. And you were saying as Home Secretary, well, I'm not so sure about that. It seems to me that's where debate and conflict should be engaged.
That did happen
Not,
as well. But
not,
anyway.
not between the Conservative cabinet and the bureaucratic structure. I mean, what, we live in East Germany or something, don't we? Then that it's all just a bit of a parade that we elect a government, but in reality, it's just sort of performative. It's just sort of ceremonial, a bit like the monarchy. It doesn't really have any power. If you want to actually get to where the power is, work out who's running the Sentencing Guidance Council. Don't worry about the Justice Secretary. Don't worry about who the Chancellor of the Exchequer or even the Home Secretary is. Look at the models of the OBR. This has got to come to an end, surely to God.
Yeah, and the OBR's forecasts have been notoriously wrong time and time again. Their assumptions have been wrong. I think I've seen in recent months, and maybe in the last 12 months, a bit of an attenuation of their view on immigration. Maybe they are changing their view and finally coming round to my point of view a few years after the event. But their forecasts are wrong, their assumptions are wrong. They're made up of pro-immigration, let's be honest, pro-EU, kind of globalist, high tax people generally. And so they assume that more taxation is going to actually lead to more tax revenue. They don't, it's a very naive view. They don't understand the disincentivizing effect that's going to have on business and investment. But so the OBR was my kind of bête noire, I guess, really, because they were, they kind of put the spanner in the works for the plan that I had to turn around the migration crisis.
Well, you might be happy to hear that last month I set up a company in order to rival the OBR. I set up Popular Forecasting, I called it, and I've set up 3 economic models to rival the OBR's forecasts. We might be able to get a link in the chat if people missed it at the time. I should say I did set it up on the 1st of April, which might be a bit of a clue. But my various models were basing assumptions about economic growth on simply picking random numbers between 1% and 2% out of a hat. I had another more complex model, which was based on the square root of the number of goals scored in a Premier League in any given season. And then another model, which was to take the OBR's projections and just assume they're a bit optimistic and lock 0.3 or 0.4% off them. And I'm going to keeping a beady eye on whether my models, which 3 of them, which took me a total of 30 minutes to create all 3, end up being more accurate than the OBR over the coming 4 or 5 years or not. And my instinct tells me they will be more accurate than the OBR. So at the very least, if we don't scrap the OBR, which I think we should, put them on performance-related pay. If their guess is no better than mine, why am I having to do this as an act of charity whilst they've got 50 staff pretending they know what the future is? Look, Suella, I want to end on a few questions about you because there's been lots of them from our audience. Councillor Brian Sylvester, good to know we've still got some Conservative councillors. Why is Suella not in the shadow cabinet? Paul Dakari asks, who should be the next leader of the Conservative Party? Not that there's presently a vacancy. Gary Flett says, Suella, please, please, please throw your hat in the ring for any leadership election. Lester Cruz says, why is she not our leader? No, I don't want to place you in an embarrassing position about what, might happen in what we know is, an unpredictable and unfolding world of politics and seems to move faster every time. But what are your plans? I mean, I wish more power to your elbow. You always articulate the Conservative case with passion and brilliance. But what do you want to do in the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that come 2029, we're not re-electing a socialist government or even a mild-mannered pseudo-socialist government in a blue rosette, that we actually get a properly Conservative right-of-centre government in order to save Britain?
Well, one of the advantages of not being in the cabinet that I can speak freely, and it is very I have a particular vision of common sense conservatism, popular conservatism, perhaps you might call it, and I am very much enjoying speaking about what that means in all sorts of different contexts, whether it's my article today in the Telegraph about how we could make a start on cutting immigration, scrapping the Equality Act, leaving the ECHR, cutting taxation, making us great again, really, as a country. So I am very, I am working as part of the Conservative team. It's an honour. It's always an honour. Just thinking about that devastating result of July, when hundreds of our great colleagues lost their seats, not really through any fault of their own. And you realise how special it is to be an elected member of Parliament in the mother of all parliaments. And I am just really grateful to be serving the people of Fareham, Waterlooville, and I'll just keep continuing to speak up for you, for popular conservatism, and for common sense, patriotic British values.
That's great to hear. And are you feeling optimistic? Do you think we can get this absolutely catastrophic government out in 2029? I mean, as I say, everything in politics seems to happen faster now. So it used to be the case that sort of if you win a big majority, you're definitely in for 2 terms. This was said about the Conservatives in 2019. Of course, Labour's majority is about twice that in 2024. But it seems like time shrinks at the moment. So, you know, if you look back 20 or 30 years, you would have thought there's no chance of getting rid of Labour for at the next election. But everything's more febrile. Can we get rid of this ghastly bloody administration by 2029 before it ruins Britain?
Yeah, I mean, that is my objective, because they can do a lot of damage in 5 years, but they can do irreversible and devastating damage in a decade that affects a whole generation of people. And that is something I desperately don't want to see. So my objective is to get Labour out.
Suella, it's been a real pleasure. We've got through a lot of questions. Sorry I couldn't get through all of them. I know there's 99 left unanswered. I'm doing my best to sprinkle them in. I hope I picked a reasonably good sample of the questions you wanted to ask. Just before I thank Suella again, to remind you, just go into the chat box, you'll see them. Our next pop conversation is with the new Conservative MP for Windsor, Jack Rankin. That's at the slightly earlier time of 5:30 p.m. on Monday, the 12th of May. That's to say next Monday, slightly earlier time of 5:30 p.m. A link to that, and you can sign up. That's in the chat box. The following Tuesday, the 20th of May, we've got Peter Lilly, Lord Peter Lilly, our usual time of 7 p.m. I'm presuming most of you are signed up to our weekly newsletter. Otherwise, I don't know how you found us this evening. But if you're not, you can sign up to it. It tends to go out on Fridays. I held off a bit this week because I wanted to process the elections. Make sure you're signed up for that to keep abreast of all future events. Other upcoming Pop Conversations are with Chris Philp. That will be next month. And Robert Jenrick's just agreed to sit down interview with me as well. So this is the place to come if you want to hear from Britain's leading popular conservatives, engage in the discussion, and make sure that come 2029 we win. Thanks all for joining us. We've had more than 150 of you on the call this evening, but most of all, Suella, thanks to you for giving up your valuable time. It's always an absolute pleasure to hear from you. Keep fighting the good fight. I'll wish you and all of your endeavours, other than your support for Portsmouth Football Club, every success in the 12 months ahead. God bless you.
Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Over and out.